And we are live, I believe.
We are live. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Sorry.
everyone.
I'm
Sorry
just-
for the super short delay.
Just trying to connect my keyboard.
Because as we said yesterday, we are traveling, so we have different setups than the usual ones. But I think somehow we're going to make it work. So welcome, everyone. While Colin finishes setup, I can do a brief intro. We are, as usual, hosting the live of How to Build a Country. It's basically a live that we do every day from Monday to Wednesday to prepare a weekly show. There's actually a shorter version of this well curated with all the information that we gather during the 3 days of our live. Obviously the title of what we're doing is, as you can imagine, How to Build a Country. And the idea behind it is a big project that we are hosting at Atlas. But just bear with me, because I want to actually tell you about the whole project we are launching, and not only this broadcast. So first of all, let me introduce ourselves. My name is Andrea. She's
Colombe. And we need to speak louder.
And we need to speak louder because we're a bit far away from the computer. My name is Andrea, she's Colombe, as I was saying, and we are both of us the co-founders of Atlas, an organization that spans the whole of the world with many, many cool volunteers, followers, and supporters that are working with us to basically, in very simple words, unite humanity. Why? Not only because we think that it's very cool and the ethical thing to do, but because we believe that coming together across borders and manage to find ways to cooperate beyond national divisions is actually the only hope we have for humankind, to overcome conflict, to deal with climate change, to ensure that where you are when you're born or how you look like will not determine your life and your future. So for many reasons, we believe that coming together is the real reason, the real thing to do right now. And we have worked on it for 3 years now. We have done a lot of campaigns, different efforts, and together we understood what is needed now. And basically what we understood is that we need to build a global governance, a democratic global governance where you and I can vote for our representatives or similar system, depending on how exactly it's going to be shaped. But that most importantly can go beyond the interests of nations, the interests of single groups, the interest of some humans above the others, so that we can actually move forward on topics, as I mentioned before, as climate change, as technology, as wars, and try to solve them. So we need to create a very, very good way for democracies to reach everyone across the planet and for all of us to be able to express our views on the future of the world. Did I say right, Colombe?
Exactly. So basically, Atlas is the global movement that is working to create a global country, basically a type of federation, whatever you want to call it, that is democratic, where we have a say and where we can deal with climate, the fact that Amazon doesn't pay its taxes, the fact that crypto is not regulated. I mean, so many issues and so many opportunities together. And we're doing so by launching consultations on January 1st to crowdsource such a global governance. I'm going to be sending the links actually right now in the chat so that you can see it.
Fantastic. This is beautiful. So while Colombe sent the link in the chat, I can actually introduce.
Do you want to recap what we talked about in the last 2 days?
So this week, as we are building together this project in this week we are talking about supranational organizations, so international organizations. To be very concrete, we talk about the United Nations, we talk about the European Union, the Organization of American States, the African Union, depending on where you live. Basically, the organization.
We also looked at the Lycian League from 2,000 years ago.
We also look at the Lycian League for 2,000 years ago.
Forget about it.
So basically, all those organizations, they bring nation states together, and they basically try to unite humankind beyond nation states and divisions. And we have discovered very exciting things. So first of all, that 2,000 years ago, there was already a supranational organization that was very effective in bringing together people, what we call ancient Greeks, but actually people living in Turkey, on the coast of Turkey, to face off against dictatorship and invaders.
Why do you call them ancient Greeks?
Because I think culturally they were called ancient Greeks, but they actually were living in Turkey. Anyway, so we can also call it ancient Turks. That created a league of cities to stand off against the Roman Empire and the invaders. And then yesterday we went through the successes of international organizations. So instead of looking at the dark side, we went for the bright side first, and we figured out very interesting thing, including, I have a little recap in front of me, including the fact that the African Union, for example, is a very new international organization, only 20 years old, managed to create or is implementing a free trade area across Africa. There's the potential to save, to bring more than 30 million people out of poverty and actually bring great prosperity to the African continent.
And it will be the biggest ever free trade area, right?
Exactly. And among their success, apart from the free trade, there is also a very recent achievement, is the one of managing to create a task force to order vaccines together to tackle COVID-19. So basically, when people like, sadly, the global north, countries where I and Colombia come from, were hoarding vaccine and leaving Africa behind, African states said, okay, let's get together and let's try to solve this as one continent. And they managed to order more than 1 billion doses by February 2021. So great achievement, very concrete for a very new international organization. And then we look at other international organizations, the European Union, that, for example, managed to simply keep peace across the European continent, or at least in European member states, for more than 70 years, when peace in Europe has always been very frail and very susceptible to crazy dictators coming and destroying it. And we also look at the United Nations. Another random example, very important example actually, is the UNICEF, the Child Protection Agency, that since 1990s saved more than 90 million lives of children across the planet. So you see, international organizations have incredible achievements, and we must be proud as humanity to have done, to have created them, and to have find ways to include more and more people in it. But, and the reason why today we're having this show is that, sadly enough, many of these international organizations have massive shortcomings. And despite the fact that they had many good wins, they also have many flaws, mistakes, errors. And as you're going to see throughout the episode, many of these problems come from how they are designed, how they actually are structured. But we're going to get there at the end. So today, as you can imagine, I prepared the episode.
Because yesterday, the amazing episode of positivity was me.
Exactly. So the episode of negativity is on me. So Colomb doesn't know the topic we're gonna tackle. So it's gonna be very interesting to know to see your reactions, because I mean, you are quite critical of many international organizations. I know that, but you might not know a lot of the examples that you found. They are very scary.
I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of scary things. Just so you know, we're not just criticizing because we like to criticize, although I always love to bitch. That's not the point. And we're doing this because to build a better global democratic governance, we need to understand what went right with the current one, and clearly a lot has gone right. And you can watch yesterday's live stream for this. But also the flaws. And I don't know what Andrea tried to actually look at, but I think looking at systematic flaws would be, and kind of what it says about the system itself and the setup is quite interesting to design a better global governance.
Exactly. So today is 16. We're going to start with, so let's decide which international organization to start with. Because as you did yesterday, I analyzed different organizations. I found many flaws for each of them.
So what are my options?
Your options are the United Nations, the European Union, and the African Union. So I chose these three because they were the one that yesterday inspired me the most.
Okay. Yesterday we started with the African Union, so let's start with the European Union.
Okay. So the European Union is an interesting case because
I try to guess the biggest flaws?
Yes. I'm not going to say them. Can I just give a little intro?
Yeah.
Because I noticed that when Googling the criticism for against the European Union is very interesting, because the criticism are way less precise than for other international organizations. And this is because I think it's still seen by many, at least Western commentators, so the one they find mostly on Google as an English speaker, Italian, it's still quite glorified. So there are criticisms that are very high level, structural, but very few concrete examples of shortcomings. But lucky enough, we know a lot of them. So Column, do you want to guess a few of them?
Yeah, but before that, I'm actually going to read a comment of someone who
Go
just
for
said
it.
something that I was not going to say. So Omis Coffee, just said, just a comment. There are countries that today are in the EU and had wars in the 90s, Slovenia, Croatia,
Mhm.
and others that were dictators 50 years ago, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Just a comment of Europe in peace for 70 years that I hate so much because it doesn't represent the whole E EU.
Exactly. That's why I said the European member states, because obviously when Croatia was in war, it wasn't part of the European Union, but now it is. So what I completely agree with Omis, and I think that there is often a mistake done by Europeans. So the real thing is that member states of the European Union have been in peace among themselves at the time of their membership. So Croatia and Slovenia were at war 20 years ago, or a bit longer now. But since they access the European Union, they are not anymore. And then obviously you can say, yeah, because to join the European Union, you have to be in peace. Maybe, but the de facto effect of joining the European Union is that there are no wars between the member states.
Okay, so I'm ready to pick some of what's wrong.
Go for it.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. It's a critic to European politicians. Agreed. So I'm gonna say a list because I have many, and you tell me which ones we should tackle if they are linked to it. Okay.
I didn't go full on, so there are many more. I'm sure I just selected like 4 or 5 that I think are very clear.
Okay, so I can give a few, and you tell me which one you want.
Go for it.
So the mistakes, the fundamental and structural flaws of the EU. Oh my god, I have
concrete,
so many.
Concrete, not
Okay.
like they should do better.
Okay. I have the rule of unanimity in the European Council. For me, is the biggest one. Second, the lack of a true representation when it comes to politics because of the setup of the European Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Third, the lack of real European political parties because of national setups. Third, barriers to democracy. Fourth, barriers to democracy to entry into politics in the European Parliament.
Okay.
Okay, wait, I have a lot more. Fifth, a lack of EU refugee and migration system that leads to fair and human ways of dealing with migration flows.
Yes.
Six, inherent. So the fact that national interests always prevail and it creates a club of rich nations versus less rich nations in the European Union, as we saw with the financial crisis in Greece, as we saw with COVID, with Italy. I can go on for so long.
Okay.
Wait, I have a lot
I'll stop
more.
you here.
The lack of proper redistribution of EU funds and the overarching bureaucracy, the fact that no one understands it and it's not sexy, the fact that citizens don't have a real say. I'm on a roll. The fact that we don't vote for the European Commission president.
I don't know what to do. So I think exactly because of that they will work so much in the European
By
Union.
the way, I love the EU. I'm saying that's what I love.
Colombe and I have a lot of knowledge of the shortcomings and the beautiful side of the European Union. But so I stop her here because we could go on for long. But I identified, and I think you mentioned most of them.
Not all of them?
No. I feel they are, I think, very clear for Europeans, but also for people outside of Europe. This is the most important thing. And there are shortcomings that any international organization must overcome to create real international democracy and solidarity. So the first one is, we cannot mention it first as well, there is unanimity, the problem of unanimity. So for those of you who are not Europeans, who are not into European politics, basically, do you want to explain?
Yes.
Go for it.
I love talking about the lack of democratic
Go
setup
for it.
of the EU. Thank you. I was very excited. So the unanimity, the European Union, and I didn't prepare for this, so I might make mistakes. Please correct me with kindness. And the European Union is made up of quite a few bodies. One of them is the European Parliament that is directly elected by citizens, although we can get to this later. It's extremely messed up and doesn't have a right of legislative initiative, but this is not the topic of today. You have the European Commission that is kind of the executive body. And you also have the EU Council, which is basically heads of states sitting together in a council, and it has competences over a lot of fundamental areas, such as, I think, foreign policies, trade, if I'm not mistaken, and a few others.
Yeah,
and
all the main ones, to be fair.
Yeah, and the way they make decisions is by unanimity, which means that if not all member states agree, something cannot go forward. But that's stupid as hell. Imagine having a discussion about what type of chocolate, whether it's dark chocolate, milk chocolate, or white chocolate, or caramel chocolate, is the best with 3 friends. No way you will all agree and be able to make a decision. Now imagine being 27 in a room with lots of different cultures, languages, situations, local realities, national realities, and so on, and having to make decisions on the most important topic by unanimity.
You never will.
No way everyone can agree. You can't agree on chocolate, you can't agree on foreign affairs. That was a very good sentence
Very,
you have
very
to
good.
say.
So I think this is the first shortcoming, and it's very concrete, very clear. I think
And we're not going to keep on deep diving.
if you want to dive, I think that is clear, and I think that is something that all Europeans, actually many Europeans, are aware of, and it's clearly something that is not working in the European Union.
But is it? So wasn't it designed exactly for this purpose, in order to stop a supranational body from having real competencies?
Yeah,
So from the point of view of like how it was designed, it worked exactly how those dudes in the room wanted it to work, right?
Yeah, it's just very outdated, because then you had the European Parliament, the more developing the European Commission with more powers. So clearly, it's been designed, 30, 40 years ago with a purpose, and things change, and the institution did not change. So I think that's the big shortcomings of the unanimity rule. But yes, originally it was meant for that, and I understand that the inception of a international organization, you might want check and balances because you don't know exactly.
No, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying I think it was designed for this purpose.
For that. Yeah, it's not
hypocrisy.
Exactly. It's not like an unexpected outcome. Then I think that the second big bucket of problem, and I have two very clear examples, is that despite the fact that we meaning Europeans, say that we feel Europeans, that there is strong European feelings, blah 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 blah.
Bullshit.
Actually, the European Union is still mostly a club of national interest, and you see it especially in times of crisis. You don't see it obviously in negotiations over chargers for iPhones, but you see when shit hits the fan.
Yeah, because honestly, cooler regulation, the EU made a huge point of like, oh, we managed to agree. We're going to have the same type of charges from now on. Okay, cool.
It
Like,
really doesn't change anything.
more than 5,000 people died in the Mediterranean this year.
Exactly.
Chargers, people dying.
Yeah. And I think that these national interest things translate. So I picked two examples. Recent, very clear, that touch all our lives if we were alive in the last 2 years. So most people following this streaming will have experienced them if they're from Europe. The first one is the COVID-19 crisis. So there are countless examples of how during COVID-19, especially the early month of the pandemic, each nation simply look at itself. And I think the one that I remember very clearly, because I lived through it, is when basically the pandemic hit Europe in Italy, and I'm Italian. And I remember very clearly when Italy was basically looking for protective equipment and support from other European nations. And what happened is that this support was completely denied. Borders were shut, and France and Germany, among many others, but obviously are the big countries, so it's easier to point at them, started hoarding all possible PPE equipment and blocking any shipment of support to Italy. And that happened, during the panic time. So not when things were a bit more handled and understood, but when people start dying by the thousands in Italy, and other countries were supposed to hand some support. And ironically, that support came from China and Cuba. I remember very clearly. And obviously you can say there was propaganda support, but it definitely worked. I mean, as an Italian, if I were not someone political following global affairs and so on, I would have been immediately struck by the fact that Cuba and China helped us, while France and Germany did not. And now I'm looking from the side of an Italian, but I'm sure that this happened to other countries in other times of other crises. So basically, when there is a clear crisis, things don't happen. And then, of course, the EU changed complete narrative, and there was a big joint effort to buy vaccines together. But why did that happen? Because it was more convenient for countries to buy vaccine together. Doing bulk, massive order of vaccine made the EU had a priority over other countries. So clearly there was also nationalism there. And second, made it cheaper. After the US were probably the biggest bloc in ordering vaccines, and so we could have them for a cheaper price from Pfizer and so on and so forth. So clearly there was COVID-19. If you actually look at it and you remember the romance of we are together in it, blah, blah, it was a shit show. It was clearly a shit show, national interest first, country left behind. Um, uh, Germany in particular ordered a lot of PPE equipment for itself alone at the beginning of the pandemic. So you can
But don't you
Google.
remember then, like all of the PR efforts that Germany and the Commission made, being like, "Oh no, look, we flew 5 Italians to Germany and we're helping take care of them."
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm not saying this is not a human behavior, but it's just let's be honest. That shows that there is not a supranational spirit or a strong supranational organization. Because if not, things would be handled like in nations, where within a nation, if there is a region in crisis, it's not that the other regions like lock that region away, don't help them. Things change, things don't happen that way. So nationally and supranationally, we are still behaving very differently.
And it's really interesting because yesterday in the live, oh no, on Monday on the live, I talked quite a bit about the different types of international organizations. So supranational is different from international, because supranational means that it's an entity that takes some competences away from states. So it's an entity that normally that behaves like a state normally does on certain topics.
Yeah.
So theoretically, it's supposed to be like a super country, right? Like the United States, you have the federal government that does certain things, and then states do other things. However, in the EU, we see that when, as Andrea said, shit hits the fan, and it's quite different. And we see national interests come first. Omi is saying, I remember the first week of the pandemic when in Spain, everyone was running from Italians because of a virus in Milan was not going to arrive in Spain. It was the same in France. There was also a lot of racist behavior overall. And we saw a complete lack of solidarity. We kept all PPE equipment and so on. And literally were like, no, we're not giving it away. And besides this, I remember when the funds were being voted on, I don't know if you already touched upon this, when there were some recovery funds being discussed, and some of the countries hit the worst in Europe, well, for example, Italy. And the Netherlands was like, no way we're giving a dime to Italy. Directly, you saw that we're not giving our money to others to support, even within an integrated union like the European Union. And just to point out the complete hypocrisy of the Netherlands, who should still be shamed every single day for this. There are few countries that actually benefit financially directly from the EU, that get more money than what they give, right? I mean, all countries benefit because it's an open market and so on. But I think it was like France, Germany, the Netherlands, when the UK was still in, it was the UK and so on, that basically got more money back than what they gave or something like this.
No, I think they give more.
Are you sure?
Yeah. I don't know the Netherlands, but Sweden, Germany, France, and Italy give more than what they get.
Countries.
While Colomb reviewed this, so we are now giving only example from Europe, and obviously as an Italian, I remember this more than anything. But the interesting fact is that I Googled this, and these examples are very rare. You don't find them online, as I said before. So, of course, from your countries or other countries you can remember, you can actually point out many of these examples where the EU did not behave the right way. But this is a very clear one. And then there is a recent one. So leaving behind COVID, we know we're in a new crisis. There is big energy crisis due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and we have energy problems across the world. And looking at the EU again, basically there's a problem with negotiating energy and receiving energy in the first place. And in September, on the September 29th, the German government unveiled a 200 billion euro package to cut the energy bills of German households and businesses. So basically, once more, Germany decided to move ahead instead of working as a European Union to tackle the energy crisis. It received a lot of criticism from other countries because the idea was the one of a coordinated action to tackle the energy crisis. But obviously, Germany is rich, very influential in the EU, so they could just run ahead and do it themselves instead of waiting for the weaker states or the more vulnerable states and bring them along. I'm targeting Germany. I'm sure the other countries is very similar shit. But the idea is that to show that, again, when there is a real crisis, forget about unity. Unity is just convenient in certain situations, but then it's not something that many states want to follow through with. So these are two very clear examples for me where national interest trumped clearly European interest in that sense. I have other quick example about failures of the EU. One is what Colin mentioned earlier in the live streaming. There is the situation of migrants support and redistribution. Support meaning saving lives and giving a way for people fleeing conflict or economic distress to come to the European Union. And redistribution is when they actually reach the continent, how states share the expenses and the allocation of people across borders.
Those
And
words, yeah, like the way we talk about human lives is so
Yeah, it's
wrong,
very sad.
right? It's not. Yeah, it's a whole other topic.
yeah, but this is how the EU speaks about all these things. And just to give you a sense, since 2015 or 2014, 25,000 people died attempting to cross in the Mediterranean. So 25,000 is a massive number. And in spite of that, in spite this being a situation very well known by all European governments, European institutions, and so on, Frontex, there used to be the mission that the EU financed and deployed in the Mediterranean to basically both help people in need and stop traffickers and so on, was dismantled, was stopped. So there is no more European missions in the Mediterranean helping people, saving lives, and all these efforts are basically delegated in theory to the Libyan Coast Guard and similar crooks. They're actually benefiting from the trade or simply getting money from the EU to enslave people and incarcerating them. And the only one right now saving lives in the Mediterranean are obviously either commercial ships passing by or NGOs that have the mission of saving lives. And they are constantly attacked by governments and politicians because they are doing so. So there is a massive graveyard at the border of the European Union. It's a known fact. It's not like something hidden. Everyone knows. You can open any European newspaper and find news about migrations and so on. And the institution decided to look the other way and have deals with, honestly, terrible people from other countries to pretendly control borders, which it's known to be horrible human rights violation in many sense. So this, for me, is a case where the European Union, to avoid problems with the far right and to avoid problems with governments that do not get to find a solution to kind of like share the task of hosting people, and decide to look the other way. And they can do so because they are not accountable. There's not really a public pressure on the European Union. The public pressure is always on the national governments. And so because of the concept of the European Union, they can basically let people die at the border.
Like if you watch the news recently about this, if you consider, so a week or 2 weeks ago, I don't remember when it was, there was a lot of news that in Sicily, in Italy, migrants' boats were not allowed to dock, and not everyone could disembark. Only vulnerable, so women and children, when every single refugee is vulnerable and has the right to disembark, and so on, were allowed to do so. The blame was put on Italy, and Italy is to blame for this. Italy behaved in violation of international law, and so on. But it wasn't put on the EU, with a failure from the EU to have a proper refugee, asylum, and migration scheme to welcome people humanly, to establish humanitarian corridors so that people wouldn't die at sea, because regardless, people will pass, and to share resources and so on, to be able to welcome people in the best conditions possible.
Yeah. So, clear failure. To stop boring people that are not from the EU about the EU, one last fact. And I think there is actually something that I thought about it, but I think that when you think about it objectively, there is a massive failure of the European Union that we have completely stopped looking at. There is Brexit. I mean, in the European Union, Brexit is always blamed upon British people. And obviously, there is a fair share of blame. People decide what they want and they can decide to part ways with an institution. But a lot of the criticism that people that advocated for Brexit actually brought forward during the Brexit campaign, and the reason why the Brexit campaign started, is because the European...
The fake reason.
Sorry. Let's distinguish with the fake reason, so all the economic invention about money being wasted and so on. I think these are fake reasons, but there is a real reason, is that the European Union is not democratic accountable, meaning that we can only, as European living in Europe, vote for the European Parliament, but the European Parliament is not the supreme body, let's say supreme in terms of decision making in the European Union. It's actually subdued often to the Commission and the European Council, which means that from the point of view of a Brit that doesn't like something is going in the European Union, basically your voice does not count, and you get imposed sometimes rules. So while obviously my opinion is that you need to reform things and change them and revolutionize them if needed instead of leaving something like the European Union. So I campaign against Brexit a lot. There is something to recognize that when the democratic shortcoming was very clear in the Brexit.
I mean, there's a huge democratic shortcoming. The European Parliament can't propose laws. It's insane. We're in a political union, but we only vote for people in our country. There's so many wrong things. Like we don't vote for the EU Commission president. There's basically a right of veto for unanimity and so on. It's insane.
It's completely insane. So this is to say that the European Union, despite the fact that, again, online is often glorified, has a lot of shortcomings.
So the shortcomings that I see that I think, since you're going to talk now about the African Union, you said, and the UN, that I see might be replicated and that are relevant for any global country we want to build are national interest first.
Yeah.
Democratic deficits and lack of direct representation.
Yeah.
And the last one, are those the two main points? Or
so I don't want to reveal the end of my analysis.
No, sorry, what are the other things we discussed in the EU?
In the EU, we discuss, yes, national interest, the problem of unanimity, and the idea that in general they're not accountable and legitimate for the people.
I think there's another thing though. It's and we see it with migration because we discussed migration. It's exclusion of others, right? So it's unity for certain countries and people, but then it's exclusion of others.
Yeah, that's very true. For a regional organization in particular. So do you want me to do African Union or United Nations now?
Let's do African Union so that we finish on something more global.
Yeah, I think African Union, it's actually, there's less material because a very new organization, as I said before. It's only 20 years old. So, I mean, there are concrete failures, but we also need to give a bit the benefit of the doubt, being like such a fresh organization. But I think the two criticisms that I found across several articles are the following. First of all, despite the fact that as there have been some success in the past, the African Union often failed to promote unity across the African continent, especially in international forums. A couple of examples, when there was a bid to join the United Nations Security Council, two African states in 2020, Kenya and Djibouti, really fought for the place instead of finding a common strategy and having the support of all African countries. So inner fighting within a regional bloc is often a sign of disunity, and the African Union failed to coordinate the bid and failed to promote the interest of Africa as a continent at the United Nations.
Yeah, but again, in so many countries, you can't expect unanimity.
No, but this is the mission that they have, in theory. It's the one of promoting African interest in international organization. So the European Union, for example, does that, despite the fact that they sometimes make mistakes as well. And the other one is actually something interesting, because yesterday we mentioned among their successes, debt relief and renegotiation of debt. But I read in a few accounts that actually many African states that are in debt with China and so on are left alone to renegotiate the debt. And the African Union does not manage to step up and kind of having a common narrative in debt relief. So maybe there are examples for both sides.
Yeah.
But definitely there's not a
because yesterday we saw that in 2020 they managed to renegotiate the debts or like have some debt relief for the Ivory Coast, Ghana, and another country.
Yeah. So there were some examples, but basically it's not something that consistently happens.
I guess it also depends on the interlocutor you have in front of you, right?
Exactly. China, probably.
Yeah. I don't know which one is, I mean, in general, yes, but I don't know which country would be more likely to renegotiate that.
I don't know. But as I said, the African Union has less clear shortcomings because it's very new. So you might understand that it will take longer to get to a point.
But there's less integration, for example.
And less integration as well. Now we can move on to the UN. there's so much criticism online.
Okay, can I guess?
Yes, go for it.
How many do I get?
Guess 3.
Of the failures of what is the failures of the UN? Okay.
Concrete failures.
So democracy. You told me 3, so I can do 3 with examples, right?
Not 3 in
Okay.
total.
So overall, there's a lack of democracy within the UN. So there's one issue: democracy is never mentioned as a key objective.
Mhm.
And as a result, it's made up of authoritarian countries and democratic countries, which means that there's no willingness to democratize further the United Nations, to give people a voice, a say, and so on. And so authoritarian countries and democratic countries not democratizing. The permanent members of the Security Council. So in the Security Council, which is basically the highest body, you have 5 permanent members that have a right of veto: the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. You see the lack of diversity. But also it's the same for the EU. Being able to govern by veto is stupid as hell, especially when you take countries that have such divergent interests, such as Russia and the US, China and the UK, and so on. There's no way you can take big decisions on certain topics. And we see the UN being paralyzed when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, they negotiate. Okay. But like hundreds of thousands of people have died, right? So I think the veto, lack of democracy, and it's a member states club. So national interest always and will always come first.
Mm-hmm.
Member states are represented in the United Nations. Citizens are not represented in the United Nations. And member states are represented to voice national interest, not to voice international interest, but national one. And this means that no global issue can ever get solved, even if we manage to do it without democracy, which I don't believe we can. If you look at COP27, it's every country trying to do less for themselves while asking others to do more.
Yeah.
If you looked at the pandemic, it was the same. If you look at any global topics, because it's nation first, it cannot work.
I fully agree. So I think you nailed most of the problems once more.
I know.
But I have a few interesting, concrete kind of issues that I want to bring to this slide. So let's go first through the obvious one. So we said, first of all, it's actually not only a member states club, but it's actually a nuclear power club, the UN. So the P5, the permanent 5, are all, so the most powerful countries in the United Nations, those that can veto most decisions in the United Nations. So China, the US, Russia, the UK, and France are all nuclear powers. That meant that there's often a criticism of like, basically you are telling the world that if you have nuclear powers, you are more powerful. You can decide for others. You can impose your brute force on others. And that actually is at the basis of the United Nations. So it's already, there is a wrong philosophy in what it communicates. So first of all, United Powers Club. And connected to this, obviously, the veto power. That is something that we both mentioned. So not only these nuclear powers are at the helm of the United Nations, but they can actually veto any decision passed through the Security Council. There's the highest body of the United Nations, which means that de facto they can stop anything that they don't like. And actually, I went to see some numbers because we always say that, but how many times did this happen? And it happens a lot. So I looked up to July 2019, so now 3 years ago, I found these numbers. Russia, and obviously before Soviet Union, vetoed 141 times decision of the United Nations. The United States, 83 times. The UK, 32 times. France, 18. And China, 14. So actually China is the one that behaved the best in this situation.
Yeah, but you also have to consider, wait, which one is the word, sorry?
The worst is Russia. So you have to consider joint.
You have to, exactly. So it's like for unanimity in the Council of the EU, you often see only one country saying no, but then other countries don't have to be the ones saying no.
Absolutely. But here is very, very clear the difference.
That's insane. Let me copy paste those numbers so people can actually see them.
And when you do that, I'm going to join another country, another interesting fact that is linked to a fact that I'm going to mention later, is that the US has vetoed since 1982, has vetoed 32 Security Council resolutions critical over Israel, more than the total number of vetoes cast by all other members, permanent states on this issue. So this to show that not only is wrong to have vetoes, but also because of vetoes, certain political institutions will never be solved. If the US
and it's not just political situations, because Israel is committing crimes of humanity, war crimes that's been recognized by international courts, and so on.
Absolutely.
So it's not just political affairs of a country misconducting; it's a
Human
state of
violation.
apartheid.
Exactly. And actually, I have an interesting fact, because there are a lot of commentators that actually say that the UN is very pro-Palestinian, which I'm pro-Palestinian, so I'm happy about that. But there is also a lot of anti-Semitism officially embedded in certain UN situation. I'm going to talk about that later, because I think it's interesting to bring it to light. But so veto is a big problem. And then other famous resolutions that were vetoed, for example, Russia vetoed anything related to the Syrian civil war, to Crimea, and obviously now to Ukraine. So it's clear that the current architecture of the United Nations is...
Yeah, and then even if you go, just because talking about veto, it goes beyond, right? So you have those huge powers that have owned a lot of debts of other countries. Sorry for my poor English, I'm very tired. Who managed to completely block anything at the UN. So I don't know if you all saw, but a couple of months ago, a UN report from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so the Human Rights Division of the UN, came out, showcasing that it's probable that China committed crimes against humanity in Xinjiang against Uyghurs. So such a report came out. It's an independent report and so on. It's already been said multiple times and it was already delayed. Yeah, normal. So that's the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. You then have the Human Rights Council, which is not for independence, it's countries that are elected to it. It's made up of a lot of authoritarian countries that systematically crack down on any type of human rights. So for me, its legitimacy is already very poor, but whatever. And China negotiated and pressured so strongly countries in the Human Rights Council that they voted against discussing this report. So not even taking a decision that would have been pointless, but still on this, but not even discussing it.
Yeah. So you see how veto is a big issue. And I want to, no, actually, we're done with veto. So I didn't want to, if not, I would have repeated what Colombe said. So I don't want to repeat that. So veto is a clear issue. Another very clear issue of the United Nations is actually its inability to prevent conflicts, which is interesting because the United Nations was created to prevent peace, to favor peace. Sorry, it's been an intense day. To favor peace and to ensure peace across the planet. And as we said yesterday, conflicts have decreased in the last 70, 100 years. So to a certain extent, they've been effective. But there are situations where actually the United Nations have clearly failed in preventing conflict and maintaining peace. And the most interesting ones are also those that do not involve P5 members, because obviously I understand that because of its architecture, the United Nations cannot prevent conflict in Ukraine right now. It's wrong, but it's built this way, is accepted this way right now, and so it cannot prevent it.
Before you say it, can I say something to mitigate the criticism we're going to say?
Go for it.
So it completely failed in many instances, but it's still managing to mitigate some of the consequences. So for example, the UN brokered grain deal out of Ukraine, even though Russia is now maybe refusing to keep it going when it expires on the 19th, so in 3 days. I was looking at the dates. So it didn't manage to prevent the war with Russia, and you said you won't mention P5, but still it managed to ensure that grains could reach the rest of the world when there's a high risk of famine in a lot of places. Yeah.
So it does a good job. I completely agree. But the example that I want to bring forward, because this is about their failures. So there are two very clear failures they have found, and they are countless others. So I just want to keep two. One is the famous Srebrenica massacre. So we're talking about the Kosovo War. We're talking about the 90s in Europe. I think many of us are aware of that. 400 peacekeepers, I think Dutch peacekeepers, failed to protect civilians during a Serbian attack where thousands of people were slaughtered and massacred in Srebrenica. And that's a famous, massive failure of the UN, because it's even unclear the responsibility of the peacekeepers, it's unclear why they didn't do anything, it's unclear why all of this played out. But for sure, since the UN was created, it was actually to prevent such instances, to apart from like solving international conflict, but for sure to protect civilians and be being a buffer against armies, and they stood by, left, and not helped anyone. So Srebrenica is famously mentioned as a big shortcoming of the UN. It's not the only one. If you look at the war in Darfur, Sudanese government fighting with militias. So far, I checked the number. As of 2013, so it's not even right now anymore, 300,000 people were killed in the war in Darfur. And the UN always failed to intervene or have any meaningful role in preventing the conflict. And we are not talking about P5 members. We are not talking even about international conflict. We're talking about almost a civil war where there is clearly a government that is part of the UN, and so that the UN has all the capacity to take charge. But for many political reasons, many diplomatic reasons, the UN has failed to act, and the number of deaths is outstanding. So this is not an up-to-date number, but it's already way bigger, for example, a death in Ukraine and Russia right now.
That's crazy.
So very clear example of failure. There are many more, but I just want to go on this side. I don't think there's needed to mention more, but it's clear that the system is not working. I have a few other things to bring. Maybe we're gonna skim through them quickly.
Oh, I like the Taiwan one.
We're gonna do Taiwan. I wanted to mention, because before we mentioned how the US is always protecting Israel in the United Nations. These are big shortcomings.
Sorry, because you mentioned war, let me just read a comment.
Yeah.
The UN hasn't been able to prevent Balkans wars, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Lebanon civil war, Syrian civil war, Iraq invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine, Armenia war, Azerbaijan, Western Sahara, and so on and so forth. I completely agree. I think though, when looking, and again, I'm saying what I'm going to say comes from someone who wants to fundamentally reform every single global organization to make it democratic. So basically new organizations. I think, however, if you look, I think sometimes it's better to look at the successes in preventing wars than the failures. So I completely understand Andrea's point, and it's good to point to the numbers.
Yeah.
However, you're fighting an impossible fight.
Yeah, you can't stop it.
Right? Like, for me, it's the same than the pandemic. So the WHO was credited in the past for fighting successfully some epidemics. And then, for example, I think it was for SARS or H1N1 or something like this. The Director General was completely blamed for overreacting. But we won't know if it was if she overreacted, because if she didn't overreact, maybe we would have a full epidemic. Yeah. And if you underreact, did you underreact or did you react properly and it just got out of hands? I think with global conflicts and global challenges, you're fighting, especially with the makeup of the world, because you don't have a global administration that is capable of doing properly its job. It's not like the UN always fails to prevent war. It doesn't have the tools to prevent it. And I would also be super interested to actually look at, when it's managed to successfully broker peace deals and avoid. We probably don't have it because it's a lot of diplomacy behind the scene. It's a lot of because of the membership you don't attack and so on.
Yeah. And also it was your duty to see the successes. Mine is to see the failures.
Yeah, I know. But I'm just saying, I agree. I'm just saying, we don't see a lot of the successes. And I think it's been very successful when we look at the numbers. Again, in the first decade of the 21st century, there's been less death due to conflict than in any decade of the 20th century.
Yes.
So again, it's not great. It's still shit, but it's better.
Yeah, it's better than before. So continuing through the failures. So as I said before, the US had protected Israel in so many cases, and basically in Israel, there's an apartheid state going on, horrible crimes. But it's interesting also to look at the other coin. There are many accusations of the UN to have allowed anti-Semitism in its bodies, in its policies. And obviously, a lot of these claims cannot be verified. I'm not going to go through them.
But I think those are very two different things. Huh?
Yeah,
protecting Israel and anti-Semitism.
I completely agree. But I wanted to mention, let's say, a very clear example of the UN basically, on one side, siding for the right things, and sometimes they're completely letting people go in extreme views in their own bodies. And there was this UN-sponsored conference in 2001 in Durban, South Africa. It was conference against racism, and basically leaflets were circulated with cartoons about Hitler, comparing the swastika to the Jewish Star of David, expressing the views that there was hope that the Jewish race would be or religion would be exterminated by Nazis. So very, very anti-Semitic comments in a UN conference, and this is just one example. So it's to say that whenever we look at issues, there are many different aspects, but clearly there was a failure. There is a failure in general of the UN often to take responsibility for messes inside it and kind of like protect vulnerable groups. Another interesting one is the recognition of Taiwan. So Taiwan used to be the China in the United Nations until 1971.
So just a bit of background, Taiwan is one of the most democratic countries on the planet. It ranks number 10. And it's under constant threats and potential acts of aggression by China. It is an independent country, but intergovernmental organizations refuse to recognize it as such since the 70s because of China's big economic muscles. It was before what was recognized as China, and then suddenly everyone switched like, ooh, lots of money in China, strong muscles, let's switch what being a country and being democratic means.
Exactly. So since in 1971, Taiwan was first out of the UN, and the People's Republic of China, the current China, got its seat. And since then, a country of 23 million people is completely denied any access to the United Nations, as well as most international organizations. So this is a clear failure because it is clear, it is a de facto status quo that Taiwan has its own independence, its sovereignty, it works, you have passports, you have people trading with
that
Taiwan.
are admitted across the world. Right?
Exactly. And there is a big population, 20 million people that are now represented in international fora.
So it's completely unfair, but it's also stupid as hell. And we saw it during the pandemic. So I think it's wrong. It's morally wrong. It's ethically wrong. It shows a lack of backbone for most countries and intergovernmental organizations. It also shows stupidity.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the pandemic, Taiwan was one of the few countries that managed to deal with the pandemic successfully and that had experience in how to deal with pandemics. It did it in the past. It does it well. Civil liberties don't go back, unlike in other countries. It managed to keep people safe through partnerships, through open data, and so on and so forth. It could have contributed immensely to the WHO debate and helped in cutting down the number of years we lived with a pandemic. Instead, no, because it wasn't admitted. And also because Tedros was kind of a friend of China.
Exactly. And so big shortcomings of the United Nations. I'm going to mention the last two before moving on to next steps. That are peacekeeper scandals. So peacekeepers have done great good things for the world. The blue helmets save lives and protect the civilians across the planet. But as we know, they have failed in certain instances, like Srebrenica. But more than that, there was a very worrying studies about the fact that there was a correlation, 12 country studies show a correlation between exploitation of children and the entering of peacekeepers in countries. So a big correlation between child prostitution, child exploitation, and the deployment of peacekeepers. Obviously, it's probably more complicated than that, but it's now being confirmed in many studies that this happens. So peacekeepers, when they enter a country, they bring a lot of problems as well. It's not only solutions. So these are big shortcomings, because the international army for peace, in theory, should not be plagued by such scandals. And the last one is a fairly recent one, earthquake in Haiti. The UN aid personnel was brought a cholera outbreak because they were deployed in the country without the right measures and killed more than 10,000 Haitians. The cholera outbreak brought by the UN. So while this last one, I don't know if much more could have been done, and I'm sure in the future more precautions will be taken, is still a stain on the UN record. So these are just some of the shortcomings at the end. There are more, but I think we have shown that there are many, there are political and human mistakes, and there are many that are actually structural problems. So the way that the UN is designed kind of imply that the UN will fail in certain challenges, like the one preventing conflicts, for example. So what did we learn today? And we have analyzed a lot of failures. Yesterday we analyzed the successes, and 2 days ago the stories of supranational organization.
Can I try to summarize? Or do you want to do it?
Go for it. We want to summarize.
So I think looking at the 3 days, what we've learned is that supranational organizations, basically global cooperation and unity, is not new. It happened over 2,000 years ago successfully. It showed that collaboration leads to peace, to security, and to success. We saw this with the Nation League, and from the moment we started having intergovernmental organizations like the League of Nations, which was followed by the United Nations and so on, it had very positive results overall. Yes, together we are stronger. It's like this. We saw some of the successes of different. So we looked at supranational, so organizations that have competences that states normally have, international organizations which have a common purpose and intergovernmental that are established by treaty and are permanent. And we saw a lot of really great successes, such as 90 million children being saved by UNICEF, the Giza pyramids being saved by UNESCO. We looked at vaccines being redistributed. We looked at debt relief thanks to the African Union, at big free trade, area, the biggest free trade area thanks to the African Union. We looked at the fact that we had lasting peace within member states of the European Union, that we could travel more easily, that thanks to unity again in the African Union, 30 million people might be lifted out of extreme poverty. So we looked at a lot of very positive things. In the Organization of American States, landmines were removed, and so on. So lots of very, very positive steps. However, we also see some failures that are mainly due to the design, from what I understand, of intergovernmental organizations. What I mean by this is, in all of the current world order we have, national interests always come first. Always. Whether it's in the European Union, the Organization of American States, the African Union, or the United Nations, it's organizations of member states representing national interests. This means that we don't truly redistribute vaccines, that we don't deal with climate change, that we cannot fully hold countries accountable, that there's a democratic deficit.
Yeah.
And this means we need to reform such organizations to put the global interest first, while taking into account national realities and local realities. We also saw, I think, the lack of representations of citizens. So, but for the European Parliament, which is not strong enough and not representative enough, we saw that there's no direct representation of citizens in other organizations, which is a big problem. And because we can't, as a result, move forward. That's what I have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's basically what I summarized at the end of my research. I think that without clear accountability and legitimacy, all international organizations are doomed to fail. I think that within a way to keep internal stakeholders accountable, meaning in this case member states, and not only accountable, sanction them and expelling them, and having measures that are realistic, so not unanimity, for example, they will always be national interest first, and a clear outway for misbehavior, selfishness, and also a breeding ground for authoritarians, because they are not worried of really facing consequences if they go out of line. And then basically the whole topic of national lines, as you said. And I think that the most successful example of going beyond national lines is actually the European Parliament. This shows how if citizens can vote for a supranational organization directly, they often forget their national interest, because it's not the natural way for a human to see. They vote for an ideal, for values, for a political faction. And so it's way more transnational as an approach to elections than what member states do between themselves. So direct democracy, meaning participation, direct involvement of citizens into supranational organization, is a very promising way to move beyond national interest.
Very well said.
So we are at the end of this very interesting live, I think, and I'm biased.
Qualify you live as very interesting.
Very interesting to me. I love the fact that people engage online on Twitch and YouTube. I think that we lay the ground for tomorrow's episode quite well. So tomorrow we're going to publish on YouTube around 20 minutes episode the third one on how to build a country, and the fourth will obviously be supranational organizations, and basically what we have learned from them, so that we can design a better one, a global one that is inclusive, democratic, legitimate, and where each one of us feel listened and heard.
And we'll use some of the weird examples we found out about.
Exactly. So follow us tomorrow on YouTube
YouTube.
this time, and then back on Monday with our lives. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm closing slowly.
With the link to our YouTube.